That's fine to start now. It does have a pause and stop. But you can just leave it. It's going to be very cool.
Gives a good shot.
And it shows up there as well.
Life's going great.
Yeah, any of these meetings, there's at least one computer, two super possible to do that way, nothing that you probably have, nothing you have. Same reason for doing your administration. This one, it doesn't go on the projector. It's not actually described as somebody at the very least for capturing that board. For the very least for capturing that board.
Sometimes when I take the test, like my face is on the screen, but behind it is. And of course you can hear the running. I know. I just I did that voice. I started like talking about stuff. Oh,
Yeah. Apparently. Yeah, okay. So you yeah. Okay, that should if I stand in front of the podium as opposed to okay. So that people online. Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, first day.
So I gotta watch this part, so I won't try to veer too far. Don't be quiet yet. Wow.
The people online will hear you through his.
Okay.
I mean, everybody here can hear when you speak, but people online, you need this.
Okay.
So you can move around, that's fine. But
So this is just for the people in the room.
yeah, pretty
Okay.
much. But you don't even need this. I know
Okay.
if you're speaking from here, everybody can hear.
Okay. So can I move it?
Okay.
I think they know each other.
That's okay. That's all right. I'm sorry.
They're way back. Is that someone that works here? Does she work here? And can we pull this out a
Yeah,
little?
she works here too. So she was another one of those who knows Donovan, who was part of that same postdoc. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's good.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here and joining us today. My name is Christopher King with the Department of Health Systems Administration. Thank you for being a part of the kickoff to a series of lectures on racial justice with a healthcare approach. We're going to focus on the healthcare delivery system and a series of conversations over the next couple of months. And the purpose of these conversations is really to strengthen or advance our intellectual capacity to apply a racial justice lens in practice, research, and scholarship, particularly in the healthcare space. Furthermore, these lectures and the subsequent conversations that we have will ultimately inform the healthcare component of the Racial Justice Institute. So today I am honored to introduce our guest, Dr. Derek Griffith, a leading social scientist who focuses on social influences on men's health and racial and ethnic health disparities. He primarily focuses on identifying and addressing psychosocial, cultural, and environmental determinants of African American men's health and their well-being. Funded by several institutes within the National Institutes of Health and foundations such as the American Cancer Society and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Dr. Griffith specializes in to improve African American men's lifestyle behaviors and chronic disease risks, morbidity and mortality, including reducing obesity and increasing healthy eating, physical activity, and screening, often using a community-based participatory research approach. His research has been featured in magazines and news outlets such as MSN, NPR, Time Magazine, US News and World Report, and USA Today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Derek Griffith.
Well, good afternoon. Okay. I need you to speak back to me a little bit. I need a little energy with me here. So good afternoon. All right, thank you. And thank you to those joining online. Let me just first thank the whole group of people that were responsible for bringing me here. I know it was kind of a team effort, so I really appreciate it. As I've been sort of mentioning, it's been a great visit all day, so I really thank you for doing that. As one who was born in DC, went to college outside of DC and lived in DC for a little while, I never really stepped foot on Georgetown, on Vanderbilt's campus, on Georgetown's campus. So it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to sort of join you. I'm excited to introduce sort of this topic and to talk to you about these issues. One of the things I want to do is just kind of give you sort of a context, but let me begin by just giving you some acknowledgements or acknowledging some important sort of folks for me. So, of course, let me acknowledge current and recent funders of sort of the work that we're doing. I need to acknowledge the team that I have back at home, my research team, Center for Research on Men's Health. who are sort of keeping the trains running on time back at home for me. So I appreciate that and all that they do. I also want to acknowledge my family. My sister's up here in front, my nephews are on the ends, and my parents are sort of in the middle. Just their importance and the role and the love that they have, and that keeps me going. So I appreciate that. Okay, before I get too choked up, let me move on. All right, so let me start with just this first quote from Du Bois in 1899. And the first part of this is just to simply show that we've been studying issues related to health disparities for at least 120 years. So this was literally 120 years ago. And he was saying in the Philadelphia Negro that we must endeavor to eliminate, so far as possible, the problem elements that make a difference in health among people. And clearly, one of the biggest focuses we've had in the United States has been on racial disparities. What I'm also going to hopefully make a case for is for incorporating gender and the need to look at the intersection of race and gender, amongst other things, as a way to make sure that we understand where and how to intervene with key populations that have particular health problems in our country. So one of the key questions that are going to guide my talk today are, if our goal is to achieve equity, should we measure equal opportunities to be healthy, or should we measure basically equal outcomes? So should we measure basically the determinants of health, or should we measure basically health outcomes? Are we literally seeking to have a measure of equity to be equal? And how close is, so literally are we looking at, if we looked at life expectancy, are we successful if we said, okay, everybody lives to the age of 80? And there's no difference, not 80.1, not 79.9, but everybody's exactly 80. So how close is close enough? So is 78 close enough? Is 82? You know, what needs to be close enough? And is it enough to focus on one characteristic at a time? As you can already tell, I've already said no to the answer to that, but we've tended to focus primarily on race, and I'm gonna suggest we add gender to that. There are many other things that we definitely need to add, but certainly with the data that we have, gender is one of those places that we need to pay more attention. I'm going to start with the title of my talk was in part this idea of a cautionary tale, and so I'm going to start with actually the cautionary tale. So the National Negro Health Movement was arguably the most successful health promotion program that we've had in the United States ever. It ran as a national office and a national program from 1932 to 1951, I believe. The work that was done in sort of public health was actually led by Stephen Thomas and Sandra Cross-Quinn. Actually, Sandra Cross-Quinn was the first author of most of the papers, but they sort of teamed up to do that and brought it to sort of the public health audience and really published this work about these issues. The program came out of an initiative that was founded by Booker T. Washington. Originally started out as Health Improvement Week, which became this National Negro Health Week and then National Negro Health Movement. And it was really a holistic approach to promoting health and well-being, health care, social and political advocacy, and to a comprehensive campaign to improve the health of Black Americans. And it really tried to take more of the holistic look that we're trying to sort of move back to now, which is looking at determinants of health and looking at health behavior and even community health all as one sort of holistic picture, as opposed to the way that over time we've kind of moved away and kind of focused on risk behaviors, risk factors, and so forth. This was actually initially sort of a more holistic approach to this kind of work. They use an interesting, I know there were never 8 days in a week on a calendar, but they used an 8-day week. And what they did is went Sunday to Sunday. So they included both ends of the Sunday because they anchored the work in the church. And there's still a lot of work that's being done to reach African Americans through the church. And this was sort of recognizing that, again, even 50, 60, 80 years ago, the church was still an important anchor to a lot of the health initiatives that we need to reach the African American community. Certainly not the only one, but still remains an important one today. Each day had a particular theme, and they used data to really guide what they were doing and to make the case for this in the first place. And it was primarily spearheaded, even though the program was originally sort of conceived by Booker T. Washington, most of the on-the-ground work was actually done by Black women. Okay, so here's the cautionary tale part. So in 1932, the life expectancy of whites was 63.2, and there was about almost a 10-year disparity between the life expectancy of Blacks and whites in 1932. In 1947, so 15 years later, the gap essentially closed to about 8.2 years. And while these things happened, you know, what we realized is that the gap was closing, and the gap closed about 1.3 years, essentially. And what happened is that the US Congress and this office within the US Public Health Service said, basically gave this quote, that 18 years ago, there was a pressing need to focus on the attention of particular health problems of the Negro and to concentrate efforts in the national Negro health movement. Today, we know that this movement has been successful. So successful, there's not the same urgency to emphasize separate needs. Rather, the trend is now for us to work together for mutual welfare. The National Negro Health Movement has helped to materially gain acceptance of the idea that health is everybody's business. As a result of that, and as a result of their success, they closed the office. And the disparities and the gap that closed over time began to reopen. So that was why I was asking the question, when we say, how close is close enough? When we say equity is about achieving equal outcomes, what are we trying to achieve? And are we really, you know, 1.3 years was not the same. So it still was close, but is that apparently that was close enough for them to be able to move on to something else and to close that office and close that infrastructure. Now, I could also ask the provocative question, which I won't necessarily in this talk, but I'll just throw it out to you. 1932 was also an important year for another reason that also came out of the US Public Health Service, which was the year that they started the US Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, also known to many of you as the Tuskegee syphilis study. So another interesting question that we wrote up in paper some years ago is, how is it that the National Negro Health Movement and the US Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis started in the same office, in the same year, and ran out of the same office, yet we remember them two very different ways. Remember this as sort of the great example of health equity, sort of the model for how to promote health as a nation for a group that's marginalized. And we remember, you know, the Tuskegee syphilis study as the worst ethical sort of violation we've had of a population group that we can remember. So how is it that they functioned for so long in the same office? And so I'll leave you with that just as a thought, but those are the kinds of things that we need to think about in the context of health equity. So on what measure of success might this occur again? So if we're thinking about what constitutes success in achieving health equity, what might we actually look at to measure? And so just to go through a couple of basic traditional definitions of equity, we've seen it as defined as the principle that underlies the commitment to eliminating disparities in health and its determinants. So notice that we're still focusing on determinants of health as opposed to disparities in health, including the health outcomes as part of this definition. The absence of systematic disparities in health and its determinants. So now we're still focusing on both the outcomes of health as well as the determinants of health and trying to achieve success on both ends. Then there was a switch to including the highest level of health, attaining the highest level of health for all people. And so it's not so much about the equity or the equality or them being the same in terms of outcome, but it's actually about just, can everybody achieve what their best is? And it's not necessarily about, should the best be the same for all population groups? And sort of remove that part of the question and part of the issue. And so there are different definitions of this that focus more on the inputs, if you will, versus the outcomes. Now, one of the things that's important, the reason I give you all that context and give you all those definitions is because there's also, you know, we incorporated the idea of disparities into this definition of equity. And in that context, the most common definition that we have for disparities is this one from Healthy People 2020, which is that we're focusing on groups that have systematically experienced greater obstacle to health based on a variety of characteristics. I won't try to list them all, but we have, you know, basically these various characteristics that are historically linked to discrimination or exclusion. Now, one of the things that's important is that this word "or" that's down here, that we're talking about one of these. So it's, you only need to have one of these versus what we're going to get into is what happens if you actually have one that advantages you and one that disadvantages you. What happens if you have more than one? And so how do we think about the implications of how we're going to focus on addressing disparities if we're only focusing on these things at one at a time, knowing that people represent more than one of these all the time? And so we have to recognize that there's a limitation to how we're thinking about what success means if we're only looking at one aspect of a person or one aspect of a population at a time. So this is part of the framework that they are working on for Healthy People 2030 that they're going to release relatively soon. And that does sort of look at achieving health as sort of the primary outcome. But it doesn't say achieving equity in health, it just says achieving health potential. If you look over here on the far right. So it's achieving health potential across the lifespan and health and well-being for all people. It doesn't actually say anything about whether or not those outcomes are equal. Their focus has moved, as I'll just show, to focusing on away from disease outcomes to this part of here where I just quoted out of their, essentially the white paper that they wrote, that the emphasis on equity within 2030 marks a critical shift away from focusing on disease outcomes, which are often attributed to individual behaviors. So they're going to focus primarily on the inputs and look at historical and current structural prejudice, discrimination, sort of the determinants, the inputs that may lead to the outcomes, but they're going to move away from essentially looking at the outcomes as the primary measure of whether or not we're successful. And while that's important, it also raises a question about how do you know if you're actually successful? Yes, you may eliminate the determinants, but we know that those determinants may not affect all groups the same way. And we know actually quite well that things like, economic discrimination, all kinds of other isms that we have in our society don't affect populations equally and certainly don't affect the health outcomes of those populations equally. So we're going to have to do a little harder thinking about what does this mean as we go forward as our measures of success. The other thing they added to their structure is that they're looking to reconfigure the goals for Healthy People 2030 around these 4 areas. So what's the public health burden or the relative significance of health and well-being to the nation? The magnitude of the disparity, so the size, and the degree to which health equity would be achieved if we reach that target. The degree to which the objective is a sentinel or a bellwether, meaning that either it's a marker of something that would actually be an important sort of point of success, or that it's sort of a canary in the mine, if you will. If we address this particular population doing worse, is something that we need to pay attention to because it suggests that the rest of the population is going to follow. And so it suggests that there's particular populations that we need to focus on and whether or not these things are actionable. And the reason I'm saying all that is because it's important to recognize the need to balance the two, to focus on both the determinants and the outcomes. And so my favorite social scientist is actually not one who actually was trained in any kind of social science, Martin Luther King Jr., who said some 60 years ago, there must be a rhythmic alternation between attacking the causes and healing the effects. And so for me, this is kind of the model, the definition of how we need to think about addressing equity, is that we need to figure out, yes, we need to deal with the determinants of health. We need to deal with racism, discrimination, those kind of factors, economic inequality, income inequality, and all those kind of factors. But we also need to make sure that we're keeping our eye on how are they affecting the health outcomes. Why is that particularly important? It's important because we know that most of those things that we're talking about that are the determinants or the causes are actually fundamental causes or basic causes, as some have called it. So whether you're talking about socioeconomic status, racism, we notice that when you call them fundamental causes, part of the reason that they've characterized that language, whether it's Lincoln Phelan or David Williams still calls it, I think, basic causes, but the idea is that there are different mechanisms and pathways through which you get from that particular determinant to the outcome. And it's not enough to just cut off that particular pathway or to fix one particular problem, because the issue is going to continue to perpetuate through other mechanisms and pathways. So the fact that we have to realize that there are dynamic processes that are going on is part of the problem that we have to deal with. If you're just looking at, and you're not considering the outcomes, just shutting off particular things as determinants is going to miss probably how it's affecting different populations differently. Okay. So to this point, one of the people that kind of got me into this work, one of the experiences actually was a conference way before I ended up at Vanderbilt, was a talk that I went to at Vanderbilt when I was still a junior faculty member, I guess, from Harold Freeman. And so he had this quote: the most robust measure of a health disparity is who dies too soon. And yet most of the time, again, as I've shown you with the different definitions, and I'm not trying to go through all the historical examples of how the definitions of disparities have changed, but we've moved away from this very stark sort of explanation of this is what success looks like, is to not have a disparity in health outcomes, or not have a disparity particularly in life expectancy or mortality rates. And that we're moving away from that, and I guess for me that still remains somewhat problematic. And I see that as part of the cautionary tale, or part of what we're thinking about as potentially a note of caution, that if we're not paying attention to that as an outcome and we're only looking at the determinants, we may be missing key things. The other part of this is a more provocative question, is should gender differences be considered disparities? So some will disagree, and there's one very prominent person who has disagreed very publicly, and certainly in her work that I very much respect and admire. But there's just an interesting sort of twist on this that I'm not completely reconciled, so hopefully you and my friends here can help me figure this out. So if you think about the definition of disparity that we had just a second ago, that disparities are groups of people who systematically experience greater obstacles to health, historically linked to discrimination or exclusion. Well, stealing my own thunder, I'm going to show you in just a second that men certainly have, we know consistently, have a shorter life expectancy than women. And we certainly would not say that men as a population group in the United States could fit this definition of having experienced, men as a group systematically do not experience greater obstacles to health based on their maleness. And they're certainly not linked to discrimination or exclusion just based on them being male. So the question of a disparity is this idea that we need to meet that definition and to see if that actually holds true for this particular population. But if it doesn't, what does that mean for how we should prioritize a particular population that doesn't meet our definition of a disparity? Okay, so just so you don't have to take my word for it, these are data from the World Health Organization, and I'm just sort of pointing your attention to, this is simpler, so these are actually on the same scale. The number of deaths under 70, so premature mortality rates due to non-communicable diseases for females and males, you can see very easily the bars are higher over here than the bars are higher over here. The bars are higher for males for premature mortality than they are for women. This is actually an issue primarily of middle age that we need to think about, which is a whole different issue, that we don't think of premature mortality in the context of life, phase of life. And what is it about being middle-aged that ends up sort of causing such problems, and why people have such different health outcomes and patterns in that particular phase of life, that as an adult, yes, we tend to focus on older age, but we don't tend to focus enough on middle age. Another little caveat. But the point of this idea of thinking about men in general and African-American men is not just a hypothetical one or just one because I do men's health. I actually do men's health because of these questions. And one of the things that was kind of a concrete example of what sort of drove this home for me was this paper that was published, I believe in 2000, I'm going to actually lie and tell you I don't remember the year, but it was David Satcher and this team here. I would do it wrong and do it injustice if I tried to remember the year, and I'll get it wrong. But what you notice is this is the paper, I don't know how many of you saw the series Unnatural Causes. Is inequality making us sick? And so in the intro sort of episode, they had this analogy of, and they used this study and this example of 83,000 excess deaths per year of African Americans being like a 747 full of passengers dying every day, every year, only full of African American passengers. Very morbid. gets even worse. So the other part of the question though is, what does the gender makeup of the passengers? The reason I raise that is because actually the gap is not driven equally by men and women. It's actually driven primarily by the gap between African-American men, 35 and older, and other groups. The worst health outcome among blacks and whites and among blacks was actually in this middle-aged and older group of black men. That was actually what was driving the disparity in outcomes over this 40-year period, and why there continued to be a gap was because of the poor health of middle-aged and older black men. That's why this issue of intersectionality, that's why this issue of looking at these things together becomes important. The racial gap masks the fact that it's not just about race, that there's actually a gender component that we're missing when we just don't focus on that. Another concrete example is very recently, we noticed that our life expectancy rates are actually, for the first time in a long time, declining. And there was this very important paper in New England Journal of Medicine that was showing that our rates sort of declining. So this is just that. And so we kind of plateaued in that we're sort of declining in this part over here for all groups, black men, black women, white men and white women. What's again missed in there is that life expectancy decreased for the second year in a row, but it was actually decreasing only among this most significant decrease was for, again, non-Hispanic black men. So even though it's a trend that we were seeing in everybody, it's a trend that we were seeing primarily being driven by what was happening in non-Hispanic black men. And it was the second year in the row that the mortality rates, the rate of dying, was actually increasing in black men, while everybody else was still decreasing. It wasn't decreasing quite at the same rate. So there's something really significant that we don't understand about the experiences of black men. And this is just more of the data from that particular presentation, or that particular paper, that was showing these trends sort of going in that direction. The other thing I want to kind of raise to your attention is this idea that it's important to kind of look at these things over time. A lot of times in the context of health disparities, we treat it as though it's a relatively recent phenomena. We treat it as though it's something that was discovered by David Satcher, or certainly may have been discovered by the folks who put together the Heckler Report in 1985, and that it was a relatively new phenomena, or certainly that's sometimes the way we treat it. But certainly the Philadelphia Negro, other studies, and just our data show that we've had these kind of disparities for a long time. Now, what's striking is, again, you'll see that in 1900, these are the gaps basically between black males and black females, and this is the gap between white males and white females. So what I make my lovely tortured students do in class is figure out, well, you see two things happening here. So everybody's living longer, with the exception of sort of what's happening now at the end. But you also see a racial gap that always existed and that is closing some, but you also see the emergence of a gender gap. And that we've got to understand how both of those are happening simultaneously while the population is getting better. So yes, we've achieved our goals of everybody living longer lives, everybody being healthier, but for some reason, we're seeing the emergence of technology, the emergence of everybody getting healthier, everybody living longer, but this gender gap sort of growing. So it's not something about biologically being male. It's not that all these men don't like going to the doctor and all that kind of stuff. We'll get into all that at some point. But there's got to be something else going on that sort of suggests that this has emerged over time and over this 100 plus year period that we need to pay attention to and think about. And so these gaps, require that we start to look at this through an intersectional lens. Now, I'm not going to go through my little pretty graph here that I adapted from Tom Levise's work, but it's basically making the idea, the suggestion that we start to look systematically through this idea of race and sex and what they mean in relation to health outcomes, so that we need to not just sort of look at a particular dimension of health or determinant of health or a social sort of factor as it relates to health, but understand and explore why does that relate to health. And think conceptually first that we need to better understand why this relates to health, then test that hypothesis with particular statistics or with particular ways of thinking about looking at the pre and post to understand how those things affect health. And it's only through using these kind of things systematically that we're going to be able to disentangle and understand how intersectionality or how these health outcomes can be improved, and more importantly, where we need to focus our attention to improve the health outcomes of people in the United States. And so this intersectional lens, there's a recent-ish National Academy of Science and Medicine report that talked about intersectionality and talked about just, I forget what the total report was called, but it highlighted the importance of intersectionality in using a health equity lens. And in this context, it was making the case that everybody's experience is fundamentally different and that we have to sort of understand it from that standpoint. And again, balance sort of the individual and the structural. So it's not, most of the time we think about things like health and population health, we're only looking at sort of structural factors, but then we miss the agency, the ability of individuals to make choices within there. Or we tend to look at individuals, look at their risk factors, their choices, their behaviors, and not look at the structures that are determining or shaping whether or not people have the opportunity to do those things. It's not to say that people can't do those things without the opportunity structures being in place, but it is saying it makes it more difficult. And all they're saying here is that intersectionality works at both of those levels, and that we have to understand, appreciate, and embrace how those work at both of those levels. And that it puts these things in context. I struck out men's because I used this, I wrote this quote, which came from one of my papers where we were talking about applying that work to men's health and men's health equity. And this idea of applying an intersectional lens to men's health requires us or allows us to really contextualize how we think about these different dimensions of health or social characteristics, socially defined characteristics, and how they affect health, that we need to look at those and combine them and see how those structures and axes of inequality constitute systematic or systems of oppression, and how they combine in unique ways to affect the health outcomes of different groups. And it allows us to basically look with more precision and more detail and more focus than simply looking at it as a global level. And so the looking at it with more of a scalpel than sort of a broad scale sort of hatchet. I know that's kind of morbid, but so in conclusion, if our goal is to really achieve equity, again, my suggestion is that we sort of go back to the future and sort of come back to the idea of looking at both, these inputs. Yes, we need to embrace and think more about these social determinants, or as the Healthy People 2030 folks have now dropped the social indeterminants and just said determinants of health, to be able to incorporate natural factors, environmental factors, and so forth, not just the built environment. So to look at those, but we also need to look at what are they doing to the health outcomes that we're talking about. I agree and get the idea that looking at disease-specific outcomes may be problematic, but are there broader outcomes like life expectancy, infant mortality, those kinds of things, mortality rates, that we might consider as outcomes to be able to look at the success or the lack thereof of the kinds of interventions that we're doing. We have to be really careful about whichever way that we look at equity, that we need to be really careful and clear about what equity means and when have we been successful, and how close is close enough, and that we have to really think through, if we get down to the same thing where we've closed the gap to, because we've closed it pretty significantly, if we close this gap even further to say a year or two, by race or by gender or both, what does that mean? Should we just quit? And should we sort of take the systems away and then take those resources and apply them to other issues and populations? Because there is sort of the limited resources that come with, say, federal government funding and so forth. So do we take those things and just give them to something else? Or do we take those things and continue to apply them, knowing that once you actually achieve equity, however you're defining it, that we're going to have to figure out how to maintain it? Because we know that given the structures, given things like fundamental causes, if we don't basically address that and we don't sort of maintain those structures that created the closing the gap, that we're going to actually watch it widen again. And we've seen that happen before. We saw it happen with the National Negro Health Movement, or what was associated with that. We saw it happen with other folks have given the example of the Civil Rights Movement and the success and the changes in life expectancy and the gap between Blacks and whites and during that period or right after that period. It closed after that. And we saw it open back up, actually, after we stopped sort of putting energy into civil rights legislation and so forth. So there are those things that we know that work, but we have to figure out how to make those sort of durable structures and create them into something that we're actually going to pay attention to. And last part is just to focus on, we're going to have to think about this idea of intersectionality more clearly. So I don't know what happened to my slide, but yeah, just to go back to the beginning, to achieve this goal of what he set from the beginning, that we have to eliminate, as far as possible, the problem elements that make a difference in health among people. Race is certainly one, gender is another. We have all these other dimensions of health that we're now starting to finally incorporate into the ways that we think about health and health equity. But we need to think systematically, clearly, and conceptually first before we look to measurement to actually start to address these issues. So, thank you.
I want to take the next 15 minutes just to give Dr. Griffith an opportunity to answer any questions that you may have in reaction to what you've heard today. We'll just open it up to the floor.
Hi, and I'm sorry, in your key questions that you asked in that slide and in some of the other definitions beforehand, the word "or" continues to struck me. It struck me in several reasons, because looking at opportunities, equal opportunities and equal outcomes together makes sense. And I don't know if the "or" was intentional in the key question because of resources, or if you're using that to see if there's some kind of weight towards of one over the other in the national conversation.
Okay, great question. So again, I sort of took the "or" sort of issue out of what Healthy People 2020 sort of did. And my point is that whatever choice that we're making, we need to be deliberate about the choice. And that if our goal is to really achieve equity, we know that it's not just looking at race, not just looking at ethnicity, not just looking at the things that we're very good at measuring at a national scale, that we need to probably look at other things that we don't usually organize our national data by to actually figure out how they're going to affect, how they do affect health and how they pattern health. So the other thing I didn't sort of give any, pay any attention to here is all the limitations of the ways that we present national data on health. So the fact that, I'm presenting these and calling them race and gender, and I'm presenting 2 races, no ethnicities, and 2 genders. I mean, so there's a problem, fundamentally in that, because it's not that I did it, it's just that that's what we got. So it's the "or" is that we're thinking very clearly about making choices like this and how, or implicitly, I'm not sort of saying how they thought about it or what, but I'm saying going forward, the importance of paying attention to what are the implications of making a choice to use a term like "or," to just do it one at a time. And I get it's much easier. What I'm suggesting is far more complicated and probably more expensive. But it's also more necessary if you're actually going to achieve equity, because you're not going to achieve it without recognizing that all groups who fit those larger population groups are not going to be affected the same way. And we know there are big groups within there that are going to be affected in different ways, and we have evidence of that, and we've shown that consistently over time. Yeah, hi.
Hi. What are some of the drivers you found in the research that are contributing to the age gap?
Ooh, great question. So a lot of the age things come with the stress that comes with being of a particular age. So the variation, I use a variation of a model called role strain, which is basically an idea that if stress is sort of the determinant, strain is the psychological experience of stress. Okay, so role strain is the stress that you experience when you're trying to fulfill different roles. So most folks who are on campus will feel the role strain of being a student, or you're sort of in this phase of life where you're trying to, your job is to be successful in this career, in this phase of your life where you're preparing yourself for future employment. So that's where your primary stress is sort of coming from. In middle age, it tends to be that of a provider, whether you're man or woman, but we've done more in men's health to look at that. And then older age, it's really about aging and the health implications of doing those kinds of things. So it's bringing that into the picture and then looking at what are the things in people's lives, in men's lives in our case, that are affecting their ability to fulfill those roles and how important the challenges that come with that. So whether it's different kind of family structures, whether it's different settings that they live in, you know, doing in a rural environment and struggling to provide for your families or contribute financially to a household is very different than being in an urban environment, a suburban environment. Having a certain amount of resources and an expectation that you're defining yourself as middle class and what that looks like for you. Even material, so we tend to think of stressors and strains in terms of, do you have enough to basically keep the lights on and do all that kind of stuff? But there's an undercurrent of stress that comes with people who actually have resources that we tend to not appreciate. And no, they're not sort of usually at the whim of one paycheck and so forth. Sometimes they often are. But there's a lot of stress that comes up with the keeping up with the Joneses, the materialism, you got to wear this, buy that, live here, live there, that you really can't afford. And that we know the differences in wealth between groups really add additional layer of stress to your ability to sort of fulfill those roles and to focus on those kinds of stressors. And so you kind of get distracted, and which is where the new WHO stuff about burnout sort of can come in the context of not just looking at depression and stress and so forth, but there's a whole new category of things like burnout that factors in there. Yeah, sure. Oh, let me start back here because then yes. Yeah.
It's an observation. In the 70s, we were moving much swifter and more effectively towards the concept of affirmative action. And the social conversation changed roughly around 1980 and in the 80s. We saw what I would have to say was a reversal of that. And as a response to that change, a lot of human resources departments shifted their conversations from equity to diversity. And that became the chief byword by which we decided we were achieving great strides in changing the mixture of people in the workplace. However, as a leader of a union and of an employer organization, what I most noticed was that we had a greater number of minorities in the workplace than ever before, but in terms of positions of leadership, an opportunity for management, that didn't change very much.
Right.
So diversity became a way of trying to satisfy an ideal, but it fell far short of the actual goal of creating equality. And I think in large part, that may still be one of the drivers of the disparities in health.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the parallel to what I was describing is actually pretty poignant. So if you think about affirmative action focused on equity and outcomes, but didn't pay attention to the equality of who had the opportunities to do that. So if you're only paying attention to one or the other, it becomes its own problem. And it shifts the problem to now, okay, now that's really bad. And now we're sort of disadvantaging people who are not part of the prioritized group to then have these outcomes. And so that raises its own set of problems. So if you're not realizing that we have to balance the inputs as well as the outcomes, then we're going to have even more problems and challenges. But I think that the affirmative action and kind of the choices, and the other point is just fundamentally the language means something. And that's sort of the big thing. We've sort of, I'm in a lot of conversations around disparities, equity, and so forth. And we define equity differently. We define disparities differently. Some people hate the term disparities. Some people prefer inequalities and equities. It's all kind of word salad that goes into all those kind of things. And we have to be clear about what we mean and define and be clear about and define what we mean and make sure that whatever you're doing actually is consistent with that and consistent with how you're measuring success in those areas too. So this sort of comes out of my past life as a program evaluator, but it's sort of that we need to sort of balance those in that way. Thanks. You had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to know if you looked at immigration status and how that relates to disparities in health, and also just to note that minority women tend to go to college and have kids, whereas that's like 80% of minority women or college students that have children are women, whereas only 15% of men that have children go back to college. So I mean, I wonder if that affects disparities as well.
Great questions, comments. I mean, so I haven't certainly personally looked at immigration status. Actually, shameless plug, there's a webinar tomorrow, actually out of UNC, and one of the presenters, whose name unfortunately I don't remember, is actually, and it's about structural racism, and she's going to talk about immigration and how immigration has been racialized and how it's basically a huge determinant of health and racial and ethnic disparities. So I really can't effectively speak to it more than to direct you to somebody who does that more than I can. I think this is, again, sort of the same sort of point of, you know, it's not to say, this is not a zero-sum game. I'm not trying to choose, you know, women's health, oh, we don't need to pay attention to that. They're doing better than men, so let's, you know, whatever. No, it's saying that there are unique patterns of how you combine different experiences and different opportunity structures that affect women differently and affect men differently. And we need a systematic approach to dealing with both. We can't just have a strategy that deals with a population group defined by one thing that we think is going to work effectively for everybody, because it doesn't. And we've seen the evidence through the data that it doesn't work. So we have to come up with more systematic, more thoughtful strategies that are going to at least take into account a handful of things. Now, the reality is that can go, you know, once you start opening that door, then there's Pandora's box. And it's like, how far do you go with ethnic groups? You know, I'm blessed with being left-handed, and you know, I think there's a huge amount of discrimination against left-handed people. But I can't, you know, notebooks and everything else, we just get the, you know, short end of the stick. I mean, there's just nothing, you know, but we're great. So there's nothing you can do about that. But that's not a priority, you know. That's not something that, you know, I'm usually going to get a whole lot of support nationally, and I don't think there's going to be a campaign and, you know, so forth to deal with that. So the point is, while that's important to me, it's not really important as sort of a determinant of my overall health, but it's an important thing to sort of factor, not that in particular. But the point is that when we think about determinants and why they matter and how they matter in relation to health, that we have to connect those. So I think that's one of the other important things you were talking about is, you know, yes, we've seen a lot of success in women of color going to college and certainly at higher rates than men. That's not to say that we don't need to continue to have women of color go to college and get higher education degrees and actually work on things like gender pay equity and those kind of issues. It's to say that how those issues factor out, we need to look and how to figure out how to make sure we continue to grow those things, as well as look at, well, why aren't the men doing that? Is it that we're sort of not valuing men sort of going to college in the same way? Is it that men aren't choosing to do it? Is it they're not choosing for certain reasons, not prioritizing it? Is it a matter of personal choice, or is there a balance of sort of cultural norms and expectations that are sort of affecting that? So it's a lot of pieces, but it's the idea to be thoughtful about it as opposed to just sort of picking the easy sort of route to do that. Yeah.
So it's intrigued by the concept of intersectionality, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we might operationalize that, or how that might inform the national conversation forward to help address this problem.
Yeah, so let me go back to this. So I'll use this only because I think it's this. So intersectionality has been criticized. Let me start there. Intersectionality came out of literature really coming from critical race theory and looking at legal scholars, Kimberly Crenshaw and others, looking at this idea that when they were trying to do things with women, and particularly women of color, that they were sort of missed in a lot of legal issues because they would be, so I think there was an example that Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in her TED Talk, where she says that, you know, it was hard for to make a case around Black women and employment in a particular thing, because they said, well, we employ Black people and they meant Black men. And then we employ white people, they employ women, but they meant white women in particular jobs. So when they were looking for Black women, they were like, well, there's no case we can make because you can't do it on race and you can't do it on gender. And so the point is that we have to both look at, you know, the combination of those because both of those are very much disadvantaged sort of things, but it's like, how do you recognize that the intersection of those meant something very different than just looking at each one? And it's not enough to just add them together and say, well, she's Black in this part and a woman in this part, and so 1 + 1 = 2. 1 + 1 is not 2 when it comes to these kind of factors. So what I'm suggesting is, and it's been useful in a lot of qualitative work to help understand the experience of what it means to be somebody who embraces multiple aspects of their identity and experience the world through multiple aspects of who they are simultaneously. The hard part has been, how do you translate that to something quantitative, and how do you utilize that to do things like program evaluation or policy evaluation, and even sort of guiding policy, health impact evaluation, and those kinds of things. And so what I like about this, that I borrowed and adapted from Tom Levis, one of my favorite papers of his, I wrote a paper when I was still a baby. Sorry, bad joke. He wrote a paper in the mid-90s. The title was something to the effect of how we need to study race but do a better job. There was some part of that. It was an ethnicity disease in a special issue in 1996 that actually David Williams edited. But the point was, he was saying we need to look at these things, but look at them thoughtfully and systematically. So he actually came up with this, and then the part that's in gold here that I added about gender is something I added to the model, but the rest of it essentially updates with the language of his model. The point is, I know it's a long-winded explanation, but the point is, you have these structures, and then you have the physical characteristics that sort of trigger how people or populations experience the structures. That's where these observed indicators sort of come up. The question is, and what his main contribution, I think, was using this word proxy. So these physical characteristics are proxy for what you're going to experience. So if you think about somebody who checks these boxes, because nobody knows what you're checking if you're checking boxes. So it's about, when you go into a particular space, what do you look like, and people respond to you socially based on that. When you go into spaces, there are going to be economic and environmental implications of the choices that you make that are associated with people's experience of you as a race and sex being. And that will lead to, one of the things it will lead to is exposure to stressors and risks for some people. And some people, it would actually, lead to protections and, advantages potentially. Gender also, would very much lead to how you're supposed to cope with stress, how you might think about stress. Men historically don't necessarily recognize things or have necessarily as much language usually for how to explain negative emotion. And so, which is why you tend to have men we don't tend to think of men being depressed in quite the same way, but a lot of times they'll do things to show that they're actually having negative emotions. But it's usually more externalizing behaviors or doing things that will help to numb the experience of it. And so that's where this gendered part sort of comes in, is you see these patterns of, overeating or eating a whole bunch of stuff or drinking a whole bunch of stuff or smoking this, that, or whatever, or let me do something, over-sexualized behavior and, very risky sexual behavior, because it has this physiological response that leads to feeling better. It's not a healthy response, but it's a response nonetheless. And then ethnicity is something that is not about sort of physical characteristics per se. Actually, ethnicity is not technically supposed to have a physical characteristic component, even though we tend to associate that with having one now. But that's where ethnic groups are starting to be racialized. It's a whole different conversation. The point is, it's about sort of the identity characteristics, the cultural values associated with that, and how that relates to how you respond to health and illness behavior. What I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is basically we need to systematically look at how these different factors come together, come up with those hypotheses a priori before we actually look at any data, use that to guide how we actually analyze the data, and then go back to that and continue to recycle and refine how we understand these different things over time. But it's using something that would help you think through, well, why would race be a proxy for stress? Why would gender be a proxy for how you might cope with stress? Why would ethnicity potentially be a proxy for some type of protections you might get from stress, from cultural resources and supports and strength that you may get from being of a particular cultural, racial, religious group or something that may be more associated with your particular ethnic group. But it's just being systematic and thoughtful about how you walk through those different things, because we haven't really done a good job of quantitatively being able to disentangle, and it's not enough to just quantitatively add them together and just say you're going to control for one part or another. That just doesn't work because for other reasons. You had a comment here. Okay.
Yeah, curious to see how much do you think that geographic location intersects with this? So like, obviously we want to have it applied on a national scale.
Oh yeah.
Because it's so different. Sort of systematic.
So more shameless plugs. So you actually have one of your speakers in this series that is coming up to talk about the role of place, Daryl Gaskin. This is also part of the, I swear I should, Dr. Levy should give me like a cut out of whatever, but he was the one, I'm sorry, this is on tape. But he was the one who originally created what's called the EDIC study, which is exploring health disparities in integrated communities. What the premise of his study and why he won an award for that particular study was the simple fact that we know race and place are very much intertwined in our society, because segregation is such a huge determinant of health, that where people live with their race is a good proxy for what are the resources, the economic and social resources that they'll have that are accessible to them in their particular immediate environment and the kinds of stressors that they'll experience. So what he did is essentially, and that those would also relate to, I think it was unemployment rates as well as educational attainment rates, okay? So what he did was say, okay, well, if we know that these are issues, what are the health outcomes or racial differences in health outcomes with popular or places where people have the same rates of, they live in the same proportion. So it's basically the same proportion of blacks and whites, where the blacks and whites in those areas have essentially the same proportion of educational attainment as well as, I believe, income or job status. I forget which one, something having to do with money. And what he essentially found is place was more important than race. There were basically some health outcomes where it looked very different than the national picture, one. And the second one is it flipped in some cases the patterns that we saw at a national level. So there were some outcomes in cases that I'm not gonna remember exactly, where whites did worse than blacks in that particular area where they had these things essentially controlled for, if you will. And there were some places where blacks did worse, but for the most part, a lot of the differences went away. And what they found, it was really more place than race. And Roland Thorpe has done a lot of this work in the context of men's health. And so he's another part of that team, Daryl Gaskin, Roland Thorpe, and Dr. Levis. But it's, yes, to your point, I mean, there's a whole nother layer. Again, Roland's gonna owe me dinner too, but Roland has done some work on looking at regional differences and did some stuff about, to think about, again, if you think about obesity rates, for example, I think his paper was on obesity rates among men and where there are regional differences in the country. And looking at it, certainly we know that there are regional differences. We know the obesity epidemic is really high in the South. The Bible Belt essentially matches the stroke belt, if you will, and that usually is a population or area where all of these kind of things cluster together. So we need to pay more attention to those. And I think that's part of the other challenge when we're looking at this, and we're such a huge geographically as well as diverse sort of country. How do you take those things into account, both at the micro level as well as the macro level, and even more in between, like state, county, zip code, and all those kind of factors. So lots of work to do for us as a public health community. So, yeah.
I have to tell you, I too am a member of the left-handed community.
All right.
It really is a right-handed person's world. So, we are on this learning journey here at Georgetown. We are deepening the conversation, asking new questions, because we really want to take our work to a whole new level. Thank you for being a part of this experience. We really appreciate your time. We know you're very busy. And thank you all for coming out. We hope that you'll enjoy our reception, and you'll have an opportunity to have a more intimate conversation with Dr. Griffith. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was great.
Oh, good.
You really reinforced a lot of what we've been talking about on campus.
Oh, good.
And kind of challenged to think differently about some concepts and some things. So it was great. Absolutely.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I'm like,
Yeah.
And the gender gap is something that I'm missing.
Yeah.